What is the true nature of divine love and power?
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a really fascinating journey into the heart of ancient Egyptian belief, focusing on one of its most complex and enduring figures, the goddess Hathor.
She really is such a compelling subject. I mean, when you start to dig into the source material, you pretty quickly realize she's not just, a goddess of one or two things.
No.
She's this force that just permeates so many different aspects of the ancient Egyptian cosmos and their daily life, too.
Absolutely. So our mission today, really guided by the articles, research, and notes you've shared, is to try and unpack who Hathor was, explore this huge array of roles she played, and, understand why she held such incredible significance for the Egyptians, really across millennia.
Yeah, and it's quite a challenge, actually, precisely because she was so multifaceted. The sources tell us she was considered less of a single defined entity and more like a type of deity capable of appearing in just so many forms.
Right.
I mean, while we often hear about the seven Hathors, some texts list as many as, 362?
Wow, 362. That immediately signals we're dealing with a deity of, immense scope and maybe even some internal contradictions. Yeah.
Definitely.
She's famously associated with joy, music, dance, love, motherhood, all those wonderful things. But also, quite starkly, with this terrifyingly destructive side, particularly in her role as the Eye of Ra. And that very duality, the bringer of revelry and the instrument of divine fury, that's one of the most, striking things about her, isn't it?
It really is, and it speaks to something fundamental about the Egyptian worldview, I think. The sources suggest they saw certain powerful forces, including those associated with femininity, as capable of encompassing the full spectrum of passions.
From immense fury to profound love.
Exactly. Both extremes.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this complexity right from the beginning. What do the sources tell us about Hathor's very earliest roots? Where does this deep dive start, sort of, historically?
Well, the story seems to start much earlier than Hathor is explicitly named. We're looking back at pre-dynastic Egypt, the period stretching way back before 3100 BC.
Okay.
And in the art from this era, we find these really frequent depictions of cattle, alongside images of women with their arms raised and curved in a way that looks, remarkably like bovine horns.
Huh. So potentially an early link there between women, cattle, and divinity.
That's definitely the suggestion from the sources, yeah.
Yeah.
These images are thought to represent early cattle goddesses, deities, really deeply connected to motherhood, nourishment. I mean, think of the milk a cow provides and also the sky.
The sky connection, right.
Yeah, and a key piece of evidence here is something called Gersa palette. It's a ceremonial stone palette from the Naqada II period, and it features this silhouette of a cow's head framed by stars with horns that curve inward.
Inward curving horns, okay. And framed by stars, so that directly links the cow and the sky very early on.
Precisely. And this early concept of a bovine sky goddess is something we see echoed later, not just in Hathor, but also in other goddesses like Mehet and Nut.
So we've got these powerful bovine and sky associations floating around in the pre-dynastic period. But Hathor herself, she doesn't really step onto the scene clearly until quite a bit later. Is that right?
That's correct. She's not, let's say, unambiguously identified in the archaeological record until the 4th dynasty, roughly 2613 to 2494 BC. There are some hints, potential depictions that some scholars suggest might be from the early dynastic period, maybe around 3100 to 2686 BC, but those identifications are, they're debated.
And there's a specific visual detail that marks her clearer arrival, isn't there? Something about the horns.
Yes, exactly, and it's quite significant. Those early pre-dynastic depictions, like the cow on the Gersa palette, and also the bovine figure on the very famous Narmer palette from the very dawn of Egyptian history. They show those inward curving horns. But when Hathor is definitively depicted in the 4th dynasty, her horns consistently curve outward. That distinction, the shape of the horns, it's a key iconographic marker.
That Narmer palette figure is particularly interesting, though, because of the debate surrounding it. It's not clear-cut.
Not at all. The bovine deity appears really prominently right at the top of the palette, and it also seems to be part of King Narmer's own regalia, maybe on his belt or apron.
Okay.
Now, the Egyptologist Henry George Fisher argued this figure was actually Bat, another cow goddess whose later depictions do show those inward curving horns matching the Narmer palette.
Ah, so he sees it as Bat, not Hathor.
Right. But then another Egyptologist, Lana Troy, offered a counter-argument. She pointed to a passage in the pyramid texts that specifically associates Hathor with the king's apron, which kind of aligns geographically with where the goddess appears on Narmer's garment on the palette. So she suggests it could be an early depiction of Hathor tied to the concept of kingship, maybe predating the fully developed bat iconography, or perhaps distinguishing an early Hathor form. This whole debate really, it just illustrates the fluidity and, the interpretive challenges in tracing the origins of these ancient deities just based on early visual evidence.
Right. It's often ambiguous. But regardless of that specific, very early image, Hathor definitely rises to prominence quite rapidly in the Fourth Dynasty.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
She quickly became the primary patron deity of Dendera in Upper Egypt. She actually supplanted an earlier crocodile god who'd been worshipped there.
Crocodile god, interesting swap.
Yeah, and importantly, she also absorbed the cult of Bat in the nearby Hu region. By the Middle Kingdom, say around 2055 to 1650 BC, the two deities had largely fused into one.
So Bat essentially became maybe an older identity that was just subsumed into the rising prominence of Hathor.
That seems to be the understanding based on the sources, yes. And her rapid ascent in importance also seems to be really closely linked to a major shift in royal and religious ideology during the Old Kingdom.
Okay, what shift was that?
Well, this was the period when the sun god Ra became the central dominant deity. He was seen as the king of the gods, the divine father, the protector of the earthly pharaoh.
Right, the rise of Ra.
Exactly. And as Ra's cult grew, Hathor's significance just grew right alongside it. She became widely regarded as Ra's mythological consort, and crucially, as a result of that union, the divine mother of the pharaoh.
Ah, the divine mother aspect.
Yeah, and this relationship embedded her really deeply within the ideology that legitimized kingship itself.
Her name even seems to tie into these fundamental ideas, doesn't it? Hurt or hurt or hurt.
Yes, the most common translation is usually given as House of Horus, but the sources also offer the interpretation, my house is the sky.
My house is the sky. Wow, that's a really evocative phrase. It links her directly back to that ancient sky association we saw in the Gurza palette.
Precisely. The term house could literally mean the sky itself, the dwelling place of Horus, who is often seen as a sun or sky god.
Okay.
Or, alternatively, and perhaps more profoundly, it could refer to the goddess's own womb.
Her womb.
Yes, the womb from which Horus, in his aspect as the sun god, is born anew each morning. This reading really emphasizes her fundamental role as a cosmic mother figure, the very source of the sun's daily renewal.
So she's a sky deity, a cosmic mother associated with giving birth to the sun itself. That's huge.
Exactly, and her epithets frequently reflect this. She's called Mistress of the Sky, Mistress of the Stars. You have to remember, the Egyptians conceptualized the sky, often not as empty space, but as this vast body of water.
Right, the celestial ocean.
And the celestial ocean, yeah, through which the sun god sailed in his bark. And sky goddesses like Hathor, Mehedweret, Nut, they were all connected to these celestial waters. They were seen as the divine mothers who birthed the sun god, often cradling him between their horns.
Specifically, Hathor and Nut were said to do this daily.
Yes, they were specifically said to give birth to the sun god every single dawn. This foundational role as a cosmic birthing deity, the source of the sun's daily rebirth, it really underpins so many of her later, perhaps more familiar roles.
Okay, so we've established this really powerful image of a primal, cosmic mother figure connected to the sky and the sun. But we started by talking about her famous duality, including that truly terrifying side. Let's transition to that now, her solar connections and her formidable, sometimes vengeful aspects.
Right. So while the maternal and sky aspects are foundational, she's also very much integrated into the solar cult. She's considered a powerful solar deity in her own right, often seen as a feminine counterpart to the male sun gods like Horus and especially Ra.
A counterpart to Ra.
Yes, she was part of Ra's essential retinue, traveling with him through the sky and the underworld on his solar bark.
So she wasn't just watching the sun's journey, she was actively part of it.
She was, actively participating. Her deep connection to the sun's energy and radiance is captured in epithets like the Golden One, referring to the sun's, dazzling light. Texts from her main temple at Dendera reinforce this, stating that her rays illuminate the whole earth.
Wow.
And she was also syncretized, or sort of fused, with other goddesses associated with Ra, notably one called Nebethitepet at Heliopolis, which was Ra's main cult center.
Nebethipet, what does her name mean?
It has some intriguing translations: Lady of the Offering, Lady of Contentment, but also significantly Lady of the Vulva.
Lady of the Vulva.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this fusion, Hathor Nebuchadnezzar, really highlights her role as Ra's consort, with these strong associations with both provisioning and sexuality, right at the heart of the solar cult. The scholar Rudolf Anthes even proposed that Hathor's name, House of Horus, might specifically refer to a mythical location at Heliopolis connected to kingship, further embedding her in that solar royal ideology centered there.
So she's not just associated with the sun. She's like an embodiment of solar power in a feminine form. And that brings us directly to this concept of the Eye of Ra.
This is where her duality becomes most pronounced and, frankly, dramatic. Hathor is one of several goddesses who could manifest as the Eye of Ra.
Okay, so what is the Eye of Ra exactly?
It's this powerful, dynamic, feminine personification of the sun disk itself. It's like an extension of Ra's power, sent out into the world to act on his behalf.
So the sun disk isn't just Ra's, it is also this independent feminine force. That's complex.
It is a complex dynamic. The sun disk could sometimes even be depicted with Ra inside it. And this imagery has been interpreted as the eye goddess, serving as a kind of divine womb from which the sun god is reborn daily.
Ah, back to the womb idea.
Exactly. This cyclical relationship means the eye goddess, like Hathor, can be simultaneously seen as mother, wife, and daughter of Ra. It embodies the sun's continuous cycle of death and rebirth.
And this eye had a really crucial protective function as well, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely critical. The Eye of Ra was the fierce guardian of the sun god. It protected him from the myriad enemies of cosmic order, especially the great serpent Apep.
Right, the chaos serpent.
Yeah. Visually, it was often represented as the uraeus, that rearing cobra symbol you see on royal crowns, or in a more aggressive animal form like a fierce lioness.
Oh, lioness. That connects to Sekhmet later.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And there's even a specific manifestation called Hathor of the Four Faces, depicted as four cobras facing the four cardinal directions, constantly vigilant, watching for any threat to Ra from any quarter.
Wow, four faces watching everywhere. Okay, now let's get to the really terrifying aspect, the myths of the Eye of Ra's fury.
Right. These myths, which become particularly prominent from the New Kingdom onward, they vividly illustrate the destructive potential lurking within this divine power. The most famous version is found in the text known as the Book of the Heavenly Cow.
Okay, what happens in that story?
Well, the story recounts that Ra becomes dismayed by a rebellion among humankind that were plotting against him.
Right.
So he decides to send his eye, personified in this story by Hathor, to punish them.
And this is the moment she transforms into Sekhmet, the lioness.
Exactly. She transforms into the terrifying lioness goddess Sekhmet, who is the embodiment of destructive power, plague, vengeance.
Okay.
Her mission of punishment just escalates into this bloodthirsty massacre of humanity. The sources describe her literally reveling in the slaughter, becoming utterly consumed by this destructive frenzy.
So Ra sends her, but then realizes he's unleashed something maybe too powerful. He regrets it.
He does. Seeing the sheer extent of the devastation and fearing she might actually annihilate humanity entirely, Ra decides he has to stop her. So he devises this plan. He orders his followers to brew vast quantities of
Beer.
Yeah, tons of it, and then dye it red, often using red ochre, so it looks just like blood. This immense quantity of red beer is then poured out all across the land where Sekhmet is rampaging.
The famous red beer trick. I've heard of this.
That's the one. Sekhmet, blinded by her bloodlust and thirst, comes upon this huge lake of red liquid, mistakes it for the blood of her victims, and just starts drinking greedily. Yeah. She consumes so much that she becomes completely intoxicated. And in her drunken stupor, her destructive rage just dissipates. She reverts from the fierce, terrifying lioness Sekhmet back to her benign, beautiful form as Hathor.
Wow. That's such a dramatic narrative. What's the underlying message there? What does that myth tell us about Hathor and maybe Egyptian belief in general?
Well, the myth is incredibly revealing, I think. First, it starkly illustrates the potential for terrifying, unbridled, destructive power within a deity often associated with love and beauty. It shows the Egyptians' understanding of divine power as potentially volatile and, frankly, overwhelming.
Right.
But just as importantly, the resolution achieved through intoxication and trickery rather than, say, direct confrontation highlights that even this terrifying force can be pacified and brought back into alignment with cosmic order.
And the fact that beer, a product of civilization and pleasure, is the key.
Exactly. That offers a really profound insight, doesn't it, into how the Egyptians might have viewed the role of revelry and human enjoyment, maybe not just as frivolous pastimes, but as forces actually capable of appeasing or transforming dangerous energies.
That's fascinating. And there's a related myth that echoes this theme, the myth of the distant goddess.
Yes, this one becomes particularly prominent in the later periods, the late and Ptolemaic eras. In this myth, the eye goddess, who is sometimes identified as Hathor, isn't sent by Ra, but instead rebels against him. She wanders off in a fit of pique, often into a foreign sort of liminal land like Libya or Nubia.
She just decides to leave, goes rogue.
Basically, yeah. She becomes the distant goddess. And because she is such a fundamental extension of Ra's power and vitality, her absence weakens him significantly and disrupts the cosmic order.
Right, he needs his eye.
He does. So Ra has to dispatch another god, often a wise figure like Soth, to persuade her to return to Egypt.
And how is she persuaded this time? Is it beer again?
Well, much like the Sekhmet myth, she's typically pacified and enticed back to Egypt by the appeals of civilization, specifically through things that Hathor herself embodies in her benevolent aspect: music, dance, and wine.
Ah, music, dance, and wine. Her specialties.
Exactly. Once she's calmed and her rage or discontent is soothed, she agrees to return. Her return journey through Egypt is often depicted as this joyous procession, transforming the land as she passes. And upon her return, she's reunited with the sun god, or sometimes becomes the consort of the god who brought her back, and balance is restored.
So both myths feature this journey, this transformation from a wild, dangerous, destructive, or maybe just disruptive force back to a pacified, benevolent, and integrating one. And music, dance, and intoxication play this key role in the transformation.
They absolutely do. And taken together, these two narrative patterns, the eye sent forth in fury and the eye wandering away in rebellion, they really emphasize this profound duality within this type of deity. They reflect what the Egyptologist Carolyn Graves Brown observed about the Egyptian perception that women encompass both extreme passions of fury and love. It's a vision of the divine feminine as incredibly powerful, essential for cosmic order, but also potentially very dangerous if angered or alienated, and requiring specific, often sensory means of appeasement.
Okay. Having explored that formidable, fiery side, let's transition now to the benevolent aspects she's perhaps most widely celebrated for. Her connections to joy, music, dance, sexuality, love, motherhood, and even fate.
Right. This is where we see Hathor as the vibrant, life-affirming deity.
Yeah.
You know, Egyptian religion, unlike some others maybe, placed significant value on sensory pleasures and earthly joy.
Yeah, they weren't seen as sinful necessarily.
Not at all. They weren't seen as obstacles to piety, more like good things. Gives them the gods, really, to be celebrated.
And Hathor was central to that celebration.
Completely central. Her epithets are a direct link to this. She is the mistress of music, mistress of dance, mistress of garlands, mistress of myrrh, and perhaps most tellingly, mistress of drunkenness.
Mistress of drunkenness, yeah.
Her worship was just filled with sound and movement. Musicians played specific instruments in her honor in temples and at festivals, things like tambourines, harps, lyres.
Yeah, and the sistrum, of course. That's probably her most iconic symbol of all, isn't it?
It absolutely is. The sistrum, you know, that percussion instrument like a rattle that was shaken during rituals, it was profoundly important in her cult. Beyond its musical function, it carried these sort of erotic connotations and was linked symbolically to the creation of new life. The very sound of shaking it was believed to have apotropaic power, you know, warding off evil and invoking Hathor's positive, life-giving presence.
So the music and dance weren't just like background entertainment. They were active components of worship with specific, powerful purposes.
Precisely. And they tied directly back to those Ivro myths we were just discussing. The fact that the wild, dangerous eye goddess is pacified by beer, wine, music, and dance really highlights the ritual significance of these elements.
Right.
During festivals, particularly those associated with the Nile inundation, which in itself could be symbolically linked to the red beer of the myth, these celebrations aimed to appease the goddess on her mythic return journey. The noise and joy were meant to drive away hostile forces and ensure she remained in her benevolent, joyful aspect.
To keep her happy, basically.
Essentially, yeah. There's a text from the Temple of Edfu that explicitly states this purpose. The gods play the sistrum for her. The goddesses dance for her to dispel her bad temper.
I love that, to dispel her bad temper with music and dance.
It beautifully encapsulates the ritual goal, doesn't it? And the Festival of Drunkenness, or the Tech Festival, is the prime example of this. It was celebrated as part of the mythic return of the eye goddess. Sources describe the revelry, women carrying bouquets of flowers, drunken participants, even foreigners dancing, all creating this joyous, noisy environment intended to ensure the goddess's favorable disposition.
A big party for cosmic balance.
Pretty much. It was a powerful ritual affirmation of life, fertility, and abundance, acting as a kind of counterpoint to the potential for death and destruction embodied in her Sekhmet phase.
Okay, moving from joy and music now to her connections with sexuality, beauty, and love.
Right. Her association with joy in these ecstatic states is deeply intertwined with her role as a procreative power. In some Egyptian creation myths, Hathor actually plays a role in the very formation of the world.
Really? Can you give us an example from the source material?
Yeah, one notable myth involves the primeval creator god Adam. He was said to have brought the first generation of deities, Shu and Tefnut, into existence through the act of masturbation. Crucially, his hand in this act was seen as embodying his female counterpart or aspect. And this hand could be personified by goddesses associated with creative power, including Hathor, or sometimes Nebuchadnezzar, or another goddess called Isaset.
So she's linked to the absolute foundational act of divine creation, right from the singular source.
Wow, it's pretty fundamental, yeah. And this association continues in later periods, too.
It does.
Yeah, in a late creation myth from the Ptolemaic period, found at temples like Dendera, the god Khonsu is central, and Hathor is identified as the goddess he mates with to bring about creation. So her role as a partner in divine procreation is really enduring.
And she wasn't just a consort to Ra, as we mentioned, but to many gods, right?
Absolutely. The sources list her as consort to numerous deities: Ra, Atum, Amun, Khonsu, Horus, Montu, Shu. Quite a list.
A popular goddess.
Very. And while Mut was Amun's primary consort, especially during the New Kingdom at Thebes, Hathor, or sometimes Isis, would appear with him in contexts related specifically to sex or fertility. That indicates Hathor's particular sort of expertise in these domains.
Right.
And in later periods, notably Dendera and Edfu, Hathor of Dendera and Horus of Edfu were regarded specifically as husband and wife, the parents of divine child.
There's some specific stories that really highlight her sexual and alluring side, too.
There are. There's the tale of the herdsman from the Middle Kingdom. It's a bit enigmatic, but basically, a herdsman encounters this wild, potentially dangerous goddess in a marsh. After he pacifies her somehow, the details are unclear. He later encounters her as a nude, alluring woman. This figure is often interpreted as Hathor or a similar deity, showcasing that transformation from wildness to captivating eroticism.
And then there's the infamous scene in the contendings of Horus and Set.
Oh yes, that's a really striking example. In that New Kingdom narrative, the sun god Ra is deeply upset. He's withdrawn from the divine council, threatening the cosmic order.
Right, he's sulking.
Basically, yeah. And to snap him out of his despondency and make him laugh, Hathor performs this incredibly powerful act.
Yeah.
She exposes her genitals to him.
Whoa.
And the act is depicted as immediately effective. It restores Ra's good humor and averts disaster. Now, the exact reason why he laughed is debated. Was it sheer surprise? Or, maybe more likely, it aroused him and thus restored his vitality.
Interesting.
But either way, it undeniably portrays her sexual power as a force capable of restoring divine energy and cosmic order.
That's incredibly direct imagery. She's also celebrated just for her physical beauty, isn't she? Especially her hair.
Yes, particularly for her beautiful hair. There's an allusion in the sources to a myth about Hathor losing a lock of her hair. But unfortunately, the full story isn't preserved.
No, too bad.
It is. But the significance of this loss is really underscored by the fact that it's compared to the catastrophic injuries suffered by male deities in their conflicts, like Horus losing his eye or Set losing his testicles.
Wow, that's serious company.
It is. This comparison suggests that the loss of Hathor's hair was seen as a profound diminishment of her beauty, her sexual allure, and perhaps even her vital power.
And her connection to beauty and sexuality naturally extends to being the mistress of love, right?
Exactly. And we have compelling evidence of this from sources like the love poems found in Papyrus Chester BDS from the 20th dynasty. People didn't just admire her as some distant goddess. They actively prayed to Hathor for help in their romantic lives.
They asked her for matchmaking help.
Pretty much. One poem includes a direct prayer. I prayed to her, the text says, and she heard my prayer. She destined my mistress, meaning the loved one, for me, and she came of her own free will to see me. So she was seen as a deity who could directly influence attraction and bring lovers together.
That's lovely. Okay, moving from love to motherhood, that's another absolutely central role for Hathor.
It is hugely important. She was regarded as the mother of various significant child deities. These include Iki, who was the god of music, and the sistrum he was worshipped as her son, particularly at Dendera, also Neferhotep of Hu, and various child forms of the god Horus.
Wait, I thought Isis was the mother of Horus in the famous Osiris myth. That's like the story.
That's right, and the Isis-Osiris-Horus triad became incredibly prominent, especially from the New Kingdom onward. It's sort of the classic divine family. However, the sources suggest that the association of Hathor as Horus's mother might actually be older than the Isis connection.
Really? Older?
Potentially, yes. And even after Isis was firmly established as Horus's mother in, state theology, Hathor continued to appear in that maternal role, particularly in imagery showing her nurturing the pharaoh.
Ah, the image of the Hathor cow nursing the pharaoh, that's particularly powerful imagery, right?
It's incredibly symbolic and really significant for royal ideology. Depicting the Hathor cow suckling the king, sometimes shown specifically in a papyrus thicket, which alluded to Horus's mythological upbringing in the marshes of the Delta, visually represented the pharaoh's divine legitimacy.
Yeah.
Well, the milk of a goddess was considered a sign of divinity and royal status. So receiving nourishment directly from the divine cow symbolized that the king was divinely chosen, divinely nurtured, inheriting his right to rule from this divine mother figure. And this imagery dates back at least to the reign of Mentuhotep II in the Middle Kingdom.
So she's linked directly to both the divine birth and the legitimacy of kingship.
Absolutely. She was seen as the divine counterpart to human queens, fulfilling the celestial role of the king's wife and the heir's mother.
Okay.
And her maternal relationship with Horus also gave her a healing aspect. Remember the contendings of Horus and Set, after Set brutally injures Horus's eye, or eyes.
Right.
Hathor is the one who finds him injured and heals him. Specifically, the text says she uses gazelle's milk. This highlights her power to restore what has been damaged, linking her maternal care directly to physical healing and wholeness.
Gazelle's milk, huh? Interesting detail. And this idea of a divine family unit becomes really central to temple worship in later periods, doesn't it?
It does, particularly from the late period and right into the Ptolemaic and Roman eras. Temples were often built around a triad consisting of a principal male god, his divine wife, who in many locations was Hathor, and their child's son.
Right.
And these special birth houses, known as mamises, were specifically dedicated to celebrating the birth and upbringing of this child deity, who often represented the cyclical renewal of the cosmos and the archetypal royal heir. At Dendera, for example, the triad was Horus of Edfu as the father, Hathor as the mother, and Isi as their son.
She also has a strong symbolic connection to trees, doesn't she? And the nourishment they provide.
Yes, the sycamore tree became a really prominent symbol of Hathor, particularly its milky sap.
Milky sap.
Yeah. This sap was equated symbolically with the life-giving water of the Nile inundation and symbolized fertility and abundance. She was sometimes depicted as the sycamore tree goddess herself, with her human upper body emerging directly from the trunk, offering refreshment and life, often to the deceased in the afterlife.
Ah, connecting to the afterlife there, too.
Yeah. This tree goddess imagery links her maternal aspect to the physical nourishment of land and its inhabitants, both living and dead. And in a late creation myth from Dendera, Hathor is presented as a female solar deity, the very first being to emerge from the primordial waters, whose light and milk then nourished all living things.
Light and milk, wow. So her maternal role is just incredibly pervasive, from cosmic creation to the daily nourishment of the land and the legitimacy of the king. How do her maternal aspects compare to other major mother goddesses like Isis or Mut? Were they seen differently?
The sources draw some interesting distinctions, yeah. Isis, particularly in the Osiris myth, is characterized by her unwavering devotion, her role in resurrecting Osiris and protecting their child Horus. This represents a type of maternal love perhaps seen as more aligned with, let's say, societal norms, compared to Hathor's often depicted uninhibited sexuality.
Right, Hathor seems more passionate, maybe.
Possibly, yeah. And Mut, who is the consort of Amun at Thebes, is described as having a more authoritative character. She is less associated with overt sexuality than Hathor. There's an interesting perspective from the Insinger Papyrus, a text from around the 1st century CE.
Okay.
It uses these goddesses as sort of moral metaphors. It likens a faithful wife to Mut, while comparing Hathor to a tempting, potentially disruptive, strange woman.
Whoa, so Hathor as the other woman.
Kind of. It suggests that even in later periods, Hathor embodied this more potent, perhaps less domesticated form of feminine and maternal power compared to figures like Mut or even the highly devoted Isis. Still powerful, but maybe a bit more dangerous or unpredictable.
Fascinating. Okay, moving on to another perhaps unexpected role, Hathor's connection to fate. How does the goddess of joy and love fit into predicting destiny? That seems like a shift.
It does seem like a shift, but she's definitely connected to the Egyptian concept of Shai, which encompasses destiny or fate. And this connection comes particularly through her manifestation as the seven Hathors.
The seven Hathors again? Okay. Who exactly were they in this context? Not just multiple forms, but specifically tied to fate.
Yes, in this context, they were seen as seven distinct manifestations of Hathor who appear in several New Kingdom works of fiction, like The Tale of Two Brothers and The Tale of the Doomed Prince.
And what do they do in these stories?
Their specific role is to appear at the birth of the protagonist and pronounce his destiny. Particularly, they foretell the manner of his death.
Wow, that's a pretty somber task for aspects of a goddess known for celebration, announcing how you're going to die right when you're born.
It is, isn't it? And it really highlights the Egyptian view of fate, Shai, as this powerful, often seemingly inexorable force determined right at birth. However, the tale of the doomed prince introduces a fascinating complexity.
Oh, so...
Well, while the seven Hathors foretell the prince's death by either a crocodile, a serpent, or a dog, the protagonist seems, at least temporarily, able to evade this destiny through his own actions and maybe some divine favor.
So maybe fate isn't totally inescapable?
Exactly. It adds this layer of nuance. It suggests that while fate is powerful, there might be limited ways to navigate it, or perhaps even potentially alter it, possibly with divine intervention or just personal agency. So the seven Hathors represent the pronouncement of this seemingly inescapable destiny, but the myths themselves sometimes explore the edges of that concept. Can you cheat fate? Maybe. Sometimes.
That's fascinating, predicting death right at the moment of birth, a stark reminder of mortality woven right into the fabric of life, but with a little wiggle room, perhaps. Let's shift gears now to the geographical reach and forms of her worship. We touched on Dendera and Memphis, but she wasn't just confined to the Nile Valley, was she? Her influence spread.
Not at all. Hathor's influence extended significantly beyond the borders of Egypt proper. She became associated with trade in foreign lands. This might be linked partly to her role as a sky goddess. The stars were used for navigation.
Ah, right, protecting ships.
Potentially, yeah, protecting ships traveling on the Nile and maybe even the seas beyond. And those mythological journeys of the eye goddess wandering off into regions like Nubia or Libya also established a narrative connection to those foreign territories.
And she had a particularly strong connection to specific trading partners, like Byblos.
Yes, absolutely. Notably, the important port city of Byblos in Syria, Canaan, right on the Mediterranean coast. As early as the Old Kingdom, the Egyptians equated the local patron goddess of Byblos, who was called Balat Gibal.
Balat Gibal, okay.
They equated her with a local form of Hathor. This kind of religious syncretism served to strengthen diplomatic and, crucially, trade ties. Later texts from Dendera even refer to Hathor residing in Byblos.
So they saw their goddess in the foreign goddess.
Pretty much. And this wasn't unique. During the New Kingdom, the powerful and sometimes pretty aggressive Canaanite goddess Anet, who actually gained some worship in Egypt, was occasionally equated with Hathor too. And there's also the figure of Cantish, yet a nude goddess often depicted with a Hathor-like wig found in Canaanite art, who was adopted into Egyptian iconography and also associated with Hathor.
So she served as a kind of bridge, in a way, allowing Egyptians to understand and maybe integrate foreign goddesses and cultures within their own pantheon.
In part, yes, that seems likely. Her connection to foreign lands was also very strongly tied to accessing valuable raw materials that Egypt needed or desired.
Like what?
Well, she was intimately linked with the Sinai Peninsula, which was a critical source of turquoise and malachite, those beautiful blue-green minerals. She was often referred to as the Lady of Mefkat, which is a term for these minerals, or sometimes the Lady of Fance, that blue-green ceramic material frequently associated with her.
So Lady of Turquoise, Lady of Fance, very specific.
Very specific. And she was also worshipped at other mining sites in Egypt's eastern desert. She was called the Lady of Amethyst at Wadi El Hudi, for instance.
Directly tying her divinity to the acquisition of wealth and resources from outside Egypt proper.
Precisely. Her influence also extended south into regions like Punt, down on the Red Sea coast, which was known for incense, also linked to her, and most significantly perhaps, into Nubia, to the south.
Nubia, right.
There's this great text, the autobiography of Harkuf, a high-ranking official from the 6th dynasty. He describes his expeditions to Nubia and the valuable goods he brought back: ebony, panther skins, incense, and he explicitly refers to them as Hathor's gift to the pharaoh. It really highlights her perceived patronage over these resources acquired from abroad.
So she was the goddess who brought back the good stuff from Nubia, and her actual cult really took root there, didn't it? beyond just being tied to mining expeditions.
It did, yeah. Largely driven by Egyptian expansion and, importantly, gold mining operations during the Middle and New Kingdoms, Hathor's worship became pretty well established there. New Kingdom pharaohs built temples dedicated to her in the parts of Nubia they controlled, at sites like Faras and Mergissa. And later, during the reigns of pharaohs like Amenhotep III and Ramesses II, their principal queens like Tai and Nefertari were actually celebrated as living manifestations of goddesses, including Hathor, in temples constructed in Nubia.
Really? Queens is Hathor?
Yes, like Queen Tai at Sedenga and Queen Nefertari at the small temple of Abu Simbel. It integrated the royal women into her divine sphere in these southern territories.
So she was integrated into Nubian royal ideology as well, even after the Egyptians left.
Yes, absolutely. After Egyptian duress rule ended, the independent kingdom of Kush, which arose in Nubia, adopted Hathor into their own religious and royal framework. She was often equated with the Candaces, the Kushite queen or queen mother, who held really significant religious and political authority.
The Candake, right.
Kushite kings like Taharqa built temples to Hathor, alongside Egyptian deities like Mut at their sacred mountain, Jebel Barkal. However, it's worth noting that over time, Isis's prominence in Nubia grew significantly. And in the later Meroitic period, say from around 300 BC to AD 400, Hathor appears more frequently as a companion to Isis, rather than a principal deity on her own down there.
Interesting shift. Did her influence reach even further, maybe west or north, like into the Asian world, Greece?
Well, the sources mention a really fascinating piece of evidence, a pendant. It bears Hathor's distinctive face, and it was found in a Mycenaean tomb at Pylos in Greece.
In Greece, wow, how old?
Dates back to the 16th century BC, late Bronze Age. This single artifact suggests that people in the Mycenaean civilization had at least some awareness of Hathor, and given the funerary context of the find, perhaps specifically some knowledge of her connection to the afterlife. It really points to some unexpected cultural diffusion back then.
That's amazing. A Hathor pendant in Mycenaean Greece. But it seems her prominence in some of these foreign areas, like Byblos, eventually waned as Egyptian political power shifted over time.
That seems right, yes. After the breakdown of the New Kingdom, Egyptian influence overseas declined, and Hathor's prominence in places like Byblos definitely diminished. Isis increasingly supplanted her there in later centuries. We see hints of this in archaeological finds and also in later texts like Plutarch's on Isis and Osiris, written during the Roman period, which really emphasizes Isis's importance in Byblos by that time.
Okay, let's turn now to her iconography. Given the sheer number of her roles and forms, how did the Egyptians actually visually represent Hathor? What did she look like?
Well, she was depicted in a whole variety of ways, reflecting that multifaceted nature we've been talking about. Her most common forms include, as a cow, often bearing the sun disk between her horns, particularly when she's shown nursing the king.
Right, the divine nurse cow.
Exactly. Less frequently, she appears as a woman with a cow's head, but most typically, she's depicted as a woman wearing her distinctive headdress, those lyrate, outward curving cow horns enclosing a sun disk.
The classic Hathor look.
That's the one. And she's often shown wearing a vibrant red or turquoise sheath dress, or sometimes one that combines both colors.
And sometimes those horns appear on top of other royal headwear, like queens wore.
Yes, particularly in the New Kingdom. Her horns and sun disk might be placed atop a low modius crown, or even a vulture headdress, which was very similar to those worn by Egyptian queens.
So she starts looking more like queens, or queens start looking more like her.
A bit of both, probably. This increasing visual overlap can sometimes make it difficult to distinguish depictions of Hathor from those of Isis during this period, unless there's accompanying text identifying them, because Isis also adopted the horned sun disk headdress.
Right, they borrow from each other. How is she shown specifically in her afterlife role, as Imentet?
Good question. When embodying Imentet, the goddess of the West and the necropolis, she would wear the specific hieroglyphic emblem of the West on her head, instead of the usual horned headdress. That marked her out in that specific role.
Okay.
And the 7 Hathors, when depicted, were sometimes shown collectively as a group of 7 cows, often accompanied by the bull of the rest, another afterlife deity.
Did she take on other animal forms besides the cow? We mentioned the lioness.
Yes, definitely the lioness, reflecting her dual nature as the fierce eye of Ra. She could also appear as the rearing cobra, the uraeus, and interestingly, the domestic cat.
The cat.
Yeah, the domestic cat, which was sometimes linked to her, was seen as representing the pacified or benign form of the eye goddess, a complete transformation from the roaring lioness to the gentle house cat.
Wow, from fierce lioness to gentle house cat, another perfect example of that striking duality within her.
Absolutely. She could also be depicted in her tree form, remember, as a sycamore, often with the upper body of her human form emerging right from the trunk, offering shade and water, symbolizing her life-giving and maternal connection to nourishment and the land.
And her personal symbols and items, things she carried or wore.
Besides her distinctive headdress, she might carry a staff, sometimes just a simple papyrus stalk, or even occasionally a waz staff.
The waz staff, isn't that usually for male gods?
It usually is, yeah. It's a symbol of power, typically held by male deities. But it was used by goddesses associated with the Eye of Ra, like Hathor, highlighting their authority and power.
Interesting.
Musical and ritual items were also key, of course. The sistrum, as we discussed, came in a simple loop form, or a more elaborate naos shape, resembling a miniature shrine, often flanked by volutes, depicting the bat emblem, remember bat?
Right, the earlier cow goddess.
Yeah. And the manat necklace, that heavy, multi-stranded bead necklace, was also strongly associated with her and shaken rhythmically during ceremonies, probably adding to the soundscape of her worship.
And mirrors. You mentioned those earlier in relation to offerings.
Yes, mirrors were another important symbol. Usually made of polished gold or bronze, they reflected light, so they symbolized the sun disk. They were also associated with beauty, femininity, and perhaps the idea of seeing one's divine reflection. Some mirror handles were even specifically crafted in the shape of Hathor's face.
And finally, the architectural feature we see in so many temples, the Hathoric capital, that column top.
That's perhaps her most universally recognizable visual legacy in Egyptian architecture, isn't it? It's a really unique column capital featuring a human face, but with bovine ears. And significantly, it's shown frontally looking right at you, rather than in the typical Egyptian profile view.
Yeah, that's very distinctive.
It is. And her characteristic curling tresses cascade down the sides. These capitals were used extensively in temples dedicated to Hathor, and sometimes other goddesses too. They often feature 2 or even 4 faces, potentially symbolizing her duality or maybe her role as Hathor of the 4 faces watching over the world. The design also seems to have a complex relationship with the form of the naos-shaped sistrum.
You really do see those distinctive capitals everywhere that Hathor was important. Which brings us neatly to her worship within Egypt. Just how widespread was her cult?
Well, the sources indicate she was incredibly popular. It's even stated that more temples were dedicated to Hathor than to any other goddess in Egypt.
Wow, more than Isis. That's quite remarkable given Isis's later fame.
According to this information, yes. She had major cult centers all throughout the country. In the really important region around Memphis, the Old Kingdom capital, she was widely worshipped as Hathor of the Sycamore at numerous sites. Her main temple there in the New Kingdom was called Hathor of the Southern Sycamore, and there she was regarded as the daughter of Ptah, the chief god of Memphis.
Okay, and at Heliopolis, the main center for Ra.
Yes, a temple dedicated to Hathor-nebuchadnezzar existed at Heliopolis from at least the Middle Kingdom, and it was linked to sacred willow and sycamore trees there. She also had important cult sites up in the Nile Delta, at places like Yamu and Taranuthus.
But Dendera in Upper Egypt, that's her most famous temple complex today, isn't it? The one everyone pictures.
It is certainly the most prominent and, crucially, the best preserved one we have today. Her cult site at Dendera dates back at least to the 4th dynasty, so it's very old. And its importance grew significantly after the Old Kingdom, eventually surpassing the Memphite temples as her main cult center. The magnificent temple complex we see today, though, is largely from the much later Ptolemaic and Roman periods.
Right, built on top of earlier structures. What else was she particularly significant?
The Theban necropolis, on the west bank of the Nile near modern Luxor, was a major site for her cult from the Middle Kingdom onwards. Mentuhotep II, the pharaoh who reunified Egypt at the start of the Middle Kingdom, established a permanent cult center for her right there at Deir el-Bahari, within his mortuary complex.
Okay.
And later, the famous female pharaoh Hatshepsut incorporated a beautiful chapel dedicated to Hathor into her own, even more famous mortuary temple right next door at Deir el-Bahari.
Ah, Hatshepsut's temple, right?
Yeah. And the village of Deir el-Medina, that's the village where the skilled artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings lived, they also had multiple Hathor temples. And these remained active very late, well into the Ptolemaic period, which really reflects her importance to that community of workers and their families.
Who actually served as her clergy? Was it primarily women, given her feminine associations?
Well, interestingly, in the Old Kingdom, women did hold the highest ranks in Hathor's priesthood, including royal women. However, by the Middle Kingdom, there seems to have been a shift, and non-royal women were largely excluded from those top positions in official state cults, not just Hathor's. But women definitely continue to serve as musicians, singers, and dancers in the temple rituals for Hathor and other deities right across Egypt. That role remained important.
What were the typical rituals performed in her temples, besides the music and dance?
Well, like most Egyptian temples, the core ritual was the daily offering rite. That involved the cult statue being ritually clothed, anointed, and presented with food and drink offerings. However, the types of offerings presented specifically to Hathor were particularly distinctive.
Like what?
Wine and beer were exceptionally common offerings for her, perhaps more so than for any other deity, which links directly back to those myths of her pacification, doesn't it?
Right, the red beer, the wine.
Exactly. Sistra and Menat necklaces were also frequently offered to her and related goddesses, symbolizing her power and the ritual tools used in her worship. And in later times, Ptolemaic and Roman periods, pairs of mirrors were commonly offered, perhaps symbolizing the sun and moon, or maybe that duality again.
And the offerings themselves could be highly symbolic, not necessarily valuable in themselves.
Yes, often more so than having intrinsic value. Votive offerings included things like painted cloths depicting her image, small plaques, figurines of her animal forms like cows or cats. Some offerings explicitly alluded to her myths, like little depictions of the cow in the marsh.
Okay.
Offering Sistra may have been intended specifically to appease her dangerous aspects and evoke her beneficial side. And phalli were also offered, sometimes with inscriptions explicitly stating they represented a prayer for fertility, highlighting her direct role in procreation.
So elaborate temple rituals, but also very personal, symbolic offerings. What about popular worship, outside the official state temples? How did ordinary people connect with her?
Hathor was definitely one of the deities most frequently invoked in private worship and votive offerings, particularly by women. This often took place at small household shrines.
At home.
Yeah. Fertility and childbirth were understandably major areas of concern in popular religion, given the risks involved in ancient times. And Hathor, alongside other protective deities like the hippo goddess Taweret, was widely worshipped at home for protection during pregnancy and birth.
There's that specific detail about the birth bricks, isn't there? That sounds fascinating.
Yes, it's a really compelling piece of evidence. The only known surviving example of an ancient Egyptian birth brick, these were literally bricks used to support a woman during childbirth, is decorated with an image of a woman holding her newborn child, and she's flanked by depictions of Hathor.
Wow. Right there at the moment of birth.
Exactly. It directly illustrates her perceived role in the very moment of birth and ensuring the safety of mother and child.
And this continued even into the Roman period, her association with fertility at home.
Yes, absolutely. In Roman Egypt, archaeologists have found these terracotta figurines, often in domestic contexts, depicting a nude woman with an elaborate headdress, explicitly exposing her genitals.
It's like Hathor exposing herself to Ra.
Exactly. It's a clear visual echo of that myth. The exact meaning and use of these figurines are debated, but they are commonly thought to represent Hathor, or perhaps Isis or Aphrodite. The lines blurred, and they were likely used in household rituals related to fertility, protection, or maybe even domestic pleasure.
So she was a deity people turned to for very direct personal and practical needs in their homes and daily lives, not just in the big temples.
Absolutely. She was one of the few major deities alongside figures like Amun, Ptah, and Thoth, who were commonly prayed to by individuals for help with personal problems. People will leave offerings for her at temples or local shrines.
And the nature of these personal prayers to Hathor differed from those to, say, Amun.
According to the sources, yes, there seems to be a difference. Prayers addressed to deities like Amun often reflect this dynamic of sin, punishment, and then healing through repentance. I sinned, I was punished, I repented, please heal me.
Okay.
However, prayers directed to Hathor, as recorded on stele and graffiti, seem to focus almost exclusively on the benefits she could bestow. Things like abundant food and sustenance during life, and ensuring a well-provisioned burial in the afterlife.
So less about sin and repentance, more about asking for good things.
Exactly. She was seen, in these personal contexts at least, as a source of pure benevolence and good fortune, capable of granting wishes without necessarily requiring repentance first.
That's quite interesting, especially contrasting it with her fierce Eye of Ra aspect. It seems in personal devotion, her benevolent side was really paramount, and that connects us nicely to her role in the afterlife. How did the goddess of joy, love, and life fit into the realm of the dead? That seems like another paradox.
It might seem counterintuitive initially, yeah, but Hathor played a very significant role in Egyptian afterlife beliefs. While it's true she's mentioned only sparingly in the very earliest funerary texts, the pyramid texts from the Old Kingdom. She does appear in private tomb inscriptions from the same era. And she becomes increasingly linked with the afterlife in later texts, like the Middle Kingdom coffin texts and all the subsequent funerary literature, like the Book of the Dead.
So the connection was present early on, but it really grew in importance over time.
Precisely. Her role seems to have been fundamentally about traversing boundaries, not just between Egypt and foreign lands, as we discussed, but critically between the world of the living and the duat, the complex realm of the dead.
Okay.
She was seen as assisting souls in making this transition. And she was closely associated with the actual sites of tombs and necropolises, which were, the physical starting points for the journey into the afterlife.
And she personified the direction where the dead were buried, the West.
Yes, she was often identified with or personified as Imentet, the goddess of the West. Imentet literally means west, and the west bank of the Nile was where most major necropolises were located. The distinctive landscape of the Theban necropolis, for instance, that cliff face, was often depicted visually as a mountain from which the cow of Hathor emerged.
Ah, the cow coming out of the mountain.
Exactly, symbolizing her intimate connection to the burial ground and her role in the transition into the West, into the afterlife.
How did her role as a sky goddess giving birth to the sun connect to afterlife rebirth for humans?
It's a really key connection rooted in that Egyptian cyclical thinking. Just as the sky goddess, whether it was Nut or Hathor, fulfilling that role, facilitated the daily rebirth of the sun god Ra by giving birth to him each dawn.
Right.
She also played a crucial role in the Egyptian belief that deceased humans would undergo a similar form of rebirth in the afterlife. Coffins, tombs, the underworld itself, they were often symbolically viewed as the womb of this sky goddess, from which the deceased soul would eventually emerge into a new form of existence.
The tomb as a womb. That's powerful. And she wasn't just a guide or a symbolic womb. She actually provided for the dead, too.
Yes, providing sustenance was a major aspect of her afterlife role. Hathor, or figures identified with her like Nut or Imentet, were often depicted leading the deceased into a place where they would receive food and drink to sustain them in the afterlife.
Okay.
As Imentet, she frequently appears on tomb walls, depicted as this benevolent goddess welcoming the deceased person almost as her own child into a blissful afterlife realm. And that common image in New Kingdom's funerary art, the tree goddess.
Right, the sycamore tree.
Often Hathor or Nut, emerging from a sycamore tree to offer cool water and sustenance to the deceased in an afterlife garden. That's a powerful illustration of this nurturing, providing role after death.
There's also an interesting point in the sources about, a sexual aspect to this afterlife rebirth. How did that work?
There is, yeah, and it draws on the regenerative power of sexuality seen in other myths. The sources kind of parallel the resurrection of Osiris through his copulation with Isis and the daily rebirth of Ra through his union with the sky goddess.
Okay.
Goddesses like Isis and Hathor were seen as instrumental in rousing the deceased to new life in the afterlife. However, the source notes that this was often framed in terms of stimulating the male regenerative powers of the deceased rather than the goddess herself being the primary source of rebirth. So it reflects a complex interplay of male and female divine forces in the process of becoming effective again after death.
Interesting distinction. And how did the deceased person's actual identity relate to Hathor's name in the afterlife? You mentioned Osiris earlier.
Right, this evolved over time. Initially, in the Old and Middle Kingdoms, the deceased were often identified primarily with Osiris by prefixing their name with his, like Osiris and Utmahit, to link them directly to his resurrection. But as beliefs developed, the deceased became associated with both male and female divine powers. By the Third Intermediate Period, roughly 1070 to 664 BC, Hathor's name began to be added to the names of deceased women. Sometimes instead of Osiris, or sometimes alongside his name, as in Osiris Hathor name.
Ah, specifically for women.
Primarily, yes. This indicates a growing belief that deceased women, in particular, benefited from Hathor's revitalizing power in the afterlife, alongside, or sometimes even in parallel to Osiris's role. In some later periods, she was even spoken of as ruling the afterlife realm, just as Osiris did, showing a significant elevation of her post-mortem authority, especially concerning women.
That really highlights her specific importance for women, both in life and in the afterlife. What specific funerary practices and imagery involved Hathor?
Well, she appears frequently in funerary texts and art throughout Egyptian history. She's particularly prominent in the royal tombs of the early New Kingdom, where she's often depicted alongside Osiris and Anubis, welcoming the deceased king into the afterlife. Other imagery linked to her, found in tombs, includes that ritual called shaking the papyrus, seen in Old Kingdom tombs. It was sometimes performed explicitly for Hathor, and the rustling sound it made was perhaps likened to the rattle of a sistrum. The iconic images we mentioned, the cow emerging from the mountain, the tree goddess presiding over the afterlife garden, those are common motifs. And in the third intermediate period, while Nut was often painted on the interior lid of coffins, representing the celestial womb, Hathor sometimes appeared on the floor of the coffin, perhaps representing the earth or the source from which rebirth emerges.
And the scenes of banquets and celebration often depicted in tombs. How does she fit in there?
Yes, particularly in 18th dynasty tomb art. Those scenes showing people drinking, dancing, making music, holding minats and sistra, they're very common. And they incorporate direct Hathor imagery. While they could represent idealized private feasts for the deceased in the afterlife, they're also thought to depict gatherings at temple festivals that involved the dead, like the beautiful Festival of the Valley. During this festival, the living visited the tombs of their ancestors.
Connecting the living and the dead.
Exactly. Festivals were viewed as moments where the boundary between the living and the dead was permeable, allowing for interaction. And the widespread practice of drinking and dancing at these feasts, perhaps mirroring the festival of drunkenness, might have even been intended to induce a state of intoxication that facilitated communion between the celebrants and the spirits of the deceased.
So the celebrations of life were intricately tied to the passage to and the experience of the afterlife itself. It wasn't a complete separation.
It certainly seems that way, yeah. Hathor was also explicitly said to supply offerings to the deceased, right from the Old Kingdom onwards, ensuring they were provisioned for eternity. There were spells in funerary texts, like the coffin text, intended to allow the deceased to actually join her divine retinue in the afterlife.
Join her entourage.
Exactly. And burial goods, particularly for women, sometimes portray them as goddesses, perhaps identifying them specifically as followers of Hathor, or sometimes Isis. This strong link between Hathor and deceased women remained a significant aspect of Egyptian belief right up to the Roman period.
Her worship truly was enduring, wasn't it? Spanning thousands of years, crossing geographical boundaries.
It was really remarkable. From those magnificent state temples like Dendera and the ones in Memphis and Thebes, right down to the small, personal household shrines, Hathor was revered by virtually everyone in Egyptian society, from the highest pharaoh to the humblest commoner. And that distinctive Hathor-headed capital remains such an easily recognizable symbol of this widespread and enduring cult in Egyptian architecture.
And as we discussed earlier, her influence spread far beyond Egypt's own borders.
Yes, extending south into Nubia, north into the Levant, and through religious syncretism, even making inroads into the broader Roman Empire, the practice known as interpretatio Graeca.
Right, the Greek interpretation.
Yeah, where Egyptians equated their deities with Greek ones, this frequently saw Hathor equated with Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love and beauty. This became particularly common during the Ptolemaic period when Egypt was ruled by a Greek dynasty.
And this fusion of identities, Hathor and Aphrodite, was actually used politically to legitimize the Ptolemaic queens.
Absolutely. The ruling Ptolemaic dynasty, being of Macedonian Greek origin, needed to establish their legitimacy to their Egyptian subjects while also presenting themselves in acceptable Hellenistic terms. So the traits and iconography of Egyptian goddesses like Isis and Hathor were deliberately combined with those of Greek goddesses like Aphrodite to justify portraying the Ptolemaic queens as living divine figures.
Can you give an example?
Well, the Greek poet Callimachus, who wrote for the Ptolemaic court, subtly alluded to that myth of Hathor's lost lock of hair when he was praising Queen Berenice II for sacrificing a lock of her own hair to Aphrodite. It draws a deliberate parallel.
Ah, clever.
Yeah. And shared iconography, like the bovine horns associated with Hathor or the vulture headdress worn by Egyptian queens and goddesses, started appearing on images portraying Ptolemaic queens as Aphrodite, effectively blending these visual traditions.
So even in the final centuries of ancient Egyptian religion, Hathor's imagery and her powerful associations were still potent and adaptable, merging with other traditions as needed.
Yes, her veneration, often syncretized or appearing alongside Isis, who did become increasingly dominant in later periods, definitely continued right up until the very end of organized ancient Egyptian religion in the early centuries AD.
Wow. Okay, we have really taken a deep dive into Hathor today. I mean, from her potential origins way back in pre-dynastic cattle cults, her rapid rise in the Old Kingdom as the divine mother of the king and consort of Ra, her terrifying yet controllable power as the Eye of Ra, through to all those benevolent roles as the mistress of music, dance, joy, love, and motherhood. We've seen her connection to fate, to foreign lands, valuable resources, her unique iconography, and her pervasive worship across Egypt and beyond, extending even into her crucial role as a guide and provider in the afterlife. It's a lot.
It's truly astonishing, isn't it? How one single deity figure could encompass such a vast and frankly seemingly contradictory range of domains and powers. Creator and destroyer, nurturer and punisher, the source of life and a guide to death.
Yeah.
All in one package.
It really is. And I think that sheer complexity tells us so much about how ancient Egyptians viewed divinity, femininity, the cosmos, and the interconnectedness of life and death. They weren't afraid, it seems, to see these powerful forces as coexisting, perhaps even as essential facets of a single, powerful, divine being.
It definitely speaks to a profound comfort with duality, doesn't it? An understanding that immense love and terrifying fury aren't necessarily opposing forces, but can reside within the same entity. And maybe each is necessary, in its own way, for the functioning of the cosmos.
So, okay, here's maybe a provocative thought for you, our listener, based on everything we've discussed today. What can Hathor's unique ability to embody such extremes, from ecstatic love and creation to destructive fury and the inevitability of fate, what can that teach us about the very nature of power itself? Or perhaps more personally, about the human experience of navigating the dualities within ourselves and the world around us? Her role in both the most passionate aspects of life and the peaceful journey into the afterlife suggests this deeply holistic view, maybe, where even seemingly contrasting forces are understood as vital parts of a greater continuous cycle. Something to consider, anyway.